weekend as we take a look at some of these vehicles. But yes, we do have a whole bunch of other folks that are going to be joining us. You've already met Hannah Lopa, and Nate Dreyer is joining us as well right now in the booth here. And Nate is, Nate, you're all around vintage IndyCar on a pretty regular basis. You and I got to do some stuff together at the first ever Big Machine Music City Grand Prix with the vintage Indy cars down there in Nashville, and we're going to see vintage Indy cars here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I am absolutely thrilled to get to be a part of this event with you guys. It's going to be such a cool weekend, and great to see all this history, the modern cars as well. Going to be an absolutely incredible weekend here at the M1 Concourse for certain.
We have a really great mix on the course right now. Really cool, almost mashups of American horsepower and classic kind of English chassis. The business plan didn't go according to what they wanted to.
Yeah, no, correct. But the thing about this car is it's been incredibly successful racing throughout the decades. Yeah. SVRA champion in more modern times because, you're combining the big American horsepower, incredibly lightweight, and it just creates a really dynamic combination in this sort of lightweight racer.
It's a high-quality fiberglass body that was sold basically as a kit.
Yes.
And you could put the whole thing together. And they tried to put a deal together with Chevrolet to kind of become Chevy's version of the Cobra, and it just didn't really come together.
No.
But had it worked, it might have been right there with the Cobra, because when you hear this thing run, well, you think, well, that's exactly the group we're talking about.
For 1959, it was advanced as it got. Independent front suspension, the Dion rear axle in it. Now we see that Shelby Can-Am sports racer. Nate, you mentioned this car. It was part of a revival of the Can-Am series.
Yeah, it was a revival of the Can-Am series. Obviously, the Shelby name, and Carroll Shelby, a big part of it, with six-cylinder V6 Dodge power behind these cars. Just a unique body shape, early 90s car, built to run, and they did run in essentially support series, helped launch a lot of careers of drivers that went on to race in kart and other, especially the American Open Wheel Series. A lot of the cars went and ran in South Africa later on as well. Just a unique car, unique story, a different look, and a mashup with that old school Can-Am style and a little bit of modern look as well.
Basically a spec racer.
Yes.
In the category, I'm going to date myself here. I called a lot of these.
Yep.
And they did. They good-looking cars. Yeah, you mentioned the fact, of course, that there's a new generation of the NASCAR Cup car coming, and it's going to get more advanced from where the platform has been, but it's still not going to be where a lot of the rest of the racing world is at. So they're staying somewhat close to who and what they are, Nate.
Right, and the other thing about NASCAR that always is so interesting to me is, while yes, the basic technology may be basic, but because you have a smaller window to work with and you're looking at these more basic sort of sets, the engineering that these teams have to do in the tiny margin in terms of trying to create this side force by getting the right rear quarter panel out centimeters at a time, if you can even pull that off, it really is an interesting and really fun game to watch because, yes, things look so basic. You look at that car versus even some of the 70s and 80s Indy cars that you see in terms of aerodynamics, it looks so basic, but the teams are doing so many finite things.
Just a beautiful early fall day here in Michigan. It's a nice, cool way to start the morning. It's going to be a nice, cool day. Perfect, again, for getting drivers out there to put some laps in and not overheating anybody inside their race cars.
Well, welcome back into our SpeedSport TV booth, a dog walk. And there he goes, back to the car that Ron Grable.
Yes, and you can see the Weber carburetors on top of the small block Chevy. This combination, part of the magic of this series, at least for me, is that beautiful small block noise that comes out of these cars.
Yeah, for sure. And we talked about Lola building cars that go across motorsport. Here's an example of a Lola T192 at 5,000.
And you know what we're looking at as well with the shape of this car, we showed earlier in that kind of paddock feature, we showed the Lotus turbine car, and we saw that wedge shape. Well, when we look at these cars from the 70s, they're all taking that wedge shape.
Yeah, and it's the idea of some of the early aerodynamics, and now you're seeing, speaking of early aerodynamics,
dihedral wing.
You see that dihedral wing, Samsonite Special, Parnelli Jones team car that was driven by Joe Leonard. And a car, as you mentioned, we'll have plenty to talk about in terms of aerodynamic advancements once these cars get on. But when you look at the early 70s, you think about that wedge design and then the wild things, as you can see, the teams were doing with wings and other looks that they were just trying to learn. You can see it right there.
45 degrees at an angle of the dihedral wing. And the theory was it would be less drag and more downforce. didn't really work out the way they wanted, and they ended up popping those off and sticking the big wing on the back. And Joe Leonard did very well in these chassis without the dihedral wing mounted on it.
And Joe Leonard would go on to win what would be his second in a row USAC National Championship.
Yep, 1972. All right, Hannah, we're enjoying getting ready to go. We sure hope you're enjoying all of our coverage today on SpeedSport.tv as we've partnered up with the folks here at M1 Concourse to bring you this great event free on SpeedSport.tv. We sure hope you're enjoying it. Ralph Shaheen, Brian Loans, Nate Dreyer, and Hannah Lopa. We're all standing up, sitting down, doing different things, shaking the legs a little bit, and getting the hair up on our arms because the open wheel stuff is coming. The engines are alive, and we've got some really unique cars coming into this next group.
We're going to look at our entry list right here as we can see the various ages and the various makes we have here, from Lolas to Gurney Eagles, McLaren.
Dial in the wings and figure out what they were doing. At first, they really had a lot of issues with it. They got it to come around some. Al Unser Sr., Mario Andretti, Joe Leonard drove the three different cars. Viceroy paint schemes for Big Al and Mario, and then the Samsonite special for Joe.
And wound into that also is a story of the changing rules throughout even the month of May. So this car, Chuck Jones owns this machine, and they've had it restored to how the car was built and ran in the early part of the month of May, in the early practice sessions that year. Because by the time the race actually came around, those dihedrals were off the car. They were running a traditional rear wing. Well, that's in part due to some of the issues that they were having getting the car to handle correctly, but also because the rules in the middle of the month changed. When you came into the year, USAC had the rules set up in terms of aerodynamics where you had to have the wings as essentially part of the body, part of the chassis of the car, an integral part of that design. Well, the Eagle machines showed up with a rear wing bolted on. So you had a war that began in terms of the politics of racing with USAC, and ultimately you had rear wings and bolt-on wings allowed. Those dihedrals, while they didn't go on the car, they didn't race the car in the 500, still just a legendary design for a car that actually never took the green with that design.
Yeah, NTT IndyCar events this year. There's not a promoter on the IndyCar tour that's upset about Jimmy Johnson being in the IndyCars this season. He has been a huge draw, even though the finishes maybe haven't been what Jimmy would like to see yet. He's working hard at it, but boy, he certainly brought the fans out to the races.
And maybe if the finishes aren't there for Jimmy, to watch the last 2 or 3 races of the year, something I think really started quick for him, and we're starting to see him get back on pace, and next year when he starts to run ovals, that's going to be fun.
Also, it is a great validation of the difficulty to succeed in that series. We know Jimmy Johnson is immensely talented, but it has certainly been his work to improve, and we have seen market improvement, but his work to improve has validated everybody else's efforts over there in the NTT IndyCar Series.
Watching the turbine run again.
One of the things that, in my understanding, Nate, was so a technicality of these turbine cars that made them different than anything else is the throttle response, meaning they had none.
Right. And you think about driving in that era, and we talked about how you had to be off the throttle in these cars quite a bit. It isn't like current IndyCar where, honestly, in qualifying runs, it's 4 laps flat out. Maybe in the race, the tires are where things change a little bit on that. But this is where you're off the throttle, you're having to steer the car. So it requires a completely different driving style behind these machines to really have to think early about how you're going to lift off, let the car sweep through those corners, and then jump back on the throttle for both the short shoots. How are you going to try to do that? And then also jump on it for the long straightaways at IMS.
It's on the engine, but there really was a lot of other innovation with this car.
And you think about, back to that point I just made in terms of driving style, we'll add to that, then now you've got the four-wheel drive nature, you have a different aerodynamic handling ability in this one in terms of that wedge design that the STP and Andy Granatelli's team went through this year. They would actually try again in 1969 in a normal engine car. Now, Mario Andretti had issues with that car in the practice of that year. One going to backup car, won the race. But still interesting in terms of the aerodynamics, the handling from the four-wheel drive, as well as the power plant.
And you're getting hungry. Okay, well, the request has been put out there. Brian Loans is hungry and needs to be fed.
That is not a state that I'm unfamiliar
Well,
with.
I noticed there was a donut shop right across the street, too. I figured you already visited that one this morning.
Listen, makers and donuts, maybe they do go together. Who knows? We can try
I'm
that.
sure you'll find a way. I'm sure you'll find a way. There is a lot. Well, there you go. All right, Brian, we found your home.
This is
Yeah.
this is like flashing a water bottle to a man in the desert right now.
Yeah. Well, there you go. A lot of fun. Yeah. What are you interested in, Nate? You got a favorite there?
Probably not, but we'll see.
All right.
He's a historic Indy guy. He
Yeah.
just wants a glass bottle of milk. That's all. he
Yeah,
wants.
exactly.
Well,
There you go.
Vitamin D.
Well, for Nate, it would come in one of those old school IndyCar decanters. Remember that they would always have? Yeah.
Ralph, this is a very special moment.
This is really what the American Speed Festival is all about.
At the 2F, the enclosed car with the very coarse high wing, foot operated by the driver. That is an aluminum 427-inch big block Chevy in the back of it. And it was the best kind of the evolution, if you will, the step ahead of the 2E, which is an open cockpit car. But this is different because of the fact it is a fiberglass car.
Yeah, and you did mention taking a step back as well, talking about that rear wing being foot operated. Well, that left foot is open to be able to work that wing because these cars ran an automatic transmission that Chaparral developed with the original 2 that we'll look at as well. But something that was well known to these machines that they ran that automatic, we'll call it essentially an automatic transmission. The driver didn't have to operate and use the clutch. That left that left foot open and allowed for them to be able to operate that rear wing.
That it was battling with back in the day. 427 cubic inch big block, as you mentioned, in that fiberglass chassis.
2F won the final race of the 1967 season at Brands Hatch. Full field of Ferrari, Fords, Porsches, on and on and on that year.
And it was probably banned from competition
Right.
at that moment. As Jim Hall became, unfortunately, familiar with many times.
The hat as the logo for the Shadow team, and the nickname Shadow because everything was very dark and mysterious around the organization. And a lot of people wondered, did he work for the CIA or some other, branch of the military like that maybe MI6 or something, that James Bond type of thing.
Only in racing do we manage to have those kind of stories.
It's a fantastic, fantastic story.
And we talked a little bit about the different sides between these two cars in terms of this versus the Chaparral. We talked a lot about the Aero with the Chaparrals. This is a machine, in terms of just brute power, that took over. Didn't run for the full season, but started with 1,200 horsepower, big block V8, just absolutely thunders.
With turbos.
With turbos, yeah. They took those turbos off eventually, but still, to start and to imagine driving a car like that down, we talked about, imagine going through the kink at Road America with 1,200 horsepower behind you. Can't even fathom it.
So we talk a lot about guys, sitting around at dinner, you and your Maker's Mark, and a napkin and drawing up what it is they want to do next. So
And this car right here, this is the John Meekum Parnelli Jones car. And it is almost unfair to call it the Parnelli Jones car because he made one start in it, but what a notable start it was.
Absolutely. What an incredible story. So this is a car that has a history as both running a Chevy small block V8 as well as a Ford engine. Well, they showed up to Laguna Seca to run with that Ford engine, but they were having issues all weekend long getting that engine to run right. Went through a couple of them that they had expire through practice. So, John Meekum and the team went to Roger Penske, who obviously had a ton of Chevy engines. They borrowed one of those Chevy engines from the Penske team, and Parnelli Jones went out and won one of the heat races with that engine put in. Now remember, it isn't as simple as just bolting a new engine in. The entire car would have been designed around that Ford Westlake design in the first place, so now you have a completely different weight, completely different setup to that car, and somehow Jones still went out with that completely different engine in and won at Laguna Seca, which at that time was one of the most trying tracks in all of North America and all of the world when you think of the old layout that was essentially bypassing that inner part of the track that they run through today.
And this was late in Parnelli Jones.
Well, wherever you are around the world, we hope you are enjoying our live broadcast of the American Speed Festival from the M1 Concourse here today on SpeedSport.tv. Hi, everybody. Ralph Shaheen, Brian Lones, and Nate Dreyer with us, and we've been joined by an old friend and a legend on the racetrack and in the broadcast booth, our good buddy David Hobbs. How are you?
legend. I'll still looking over my shoulder. Well, it's good. I haven't been on one of these headsets now for about 4 years, so yeah, it's good to be back. And I tell you what, it's a splendid day for a motorsports event. An amazing selection of cars here, and obviously to be working with you again, Ralph, after a long time ago.
Yes.
So,
Absolutely, Mr. Hobbs. I think you mentioned all those cars and all those years that you raced. What about your career and about those that had careers around your time do you think made you all so unique to be able to transfer between all those different kinds of cars, the different eras, with how much things really were changing in those 20, 30 years or so?
well, the most unique thing, in my case, is that I'm still here. Because, about 25% of the people I started with were killed racing. You look at some of those cars, they're pretty flimsy, obviously as time went on. And the thing about my era was it was so dangerous because speeds picked up enormously. A tremendous increase in engine power and reliability, and a huge increase in tyre technology. When I started racing, Dunlop R5 was the only tyre. A sports car tyre was about that wide. Formula One tyre was about that wide. It had a good tread, rain or shine, it didn't matter. And then, of course, suddenly, Firestone and Goodyear got involved in international racing. Rim sizes went right out here, big, and of course slicks came in, so the grip levels went way up. But the circus didn't change much. There were still tons of trees. There were still tons of earth embankments. There were hedges. I mean, the 917s around Spa, where Brian Redman was so successful, won it 5 times. But the 917 Porsche, they're averaging 155 miles an hour through the Belgian countryside. I mean, the only thing between you and the cows in the field was the barbed wire fence. That's fairly familiar to me.
Nate, you got the goods on the Porsche here, because this is a car we talked a little bit about earlier. It is an incredible, let's call it fruit salad of Porsches.
Yeah. So this is the car. It's technically a 1974, originally a 1974 914. However, the owner also lists it as a 1974 Porsche 914 993 GT1. That's because it gets its power plant from a 993 sourced, the 3.6-liter flat six engine, and then it has that late 90s GT1 style bodywork on it. So an absolute kind of Frankenstein's monster car, but a really cool project to see regardless.
Well, I'm glad you gave us that information, because I couldn't work out quite honestly what it was.
They sell them in multiple different displacements. You can buy them with a motorcycle engine or even a V6 engine. And you hop in, you can come out, rip laps, Nate.
Right, not only can you rip laps, but also the Radical Cup here in the United States is a spec racing series that utilizes, right now on the track, we have the SR3, XX, and the SR10 versions of these cars, both of which are in different classes in that Radical Cup. So a perfect car for a track day and a circuit like here at the M1 Concourse, and also they race on weekends that support a lot of, I think they're at IndyCar at Road America and other series as well in that Radical Cup.
We also have Jonathan Finch.
Well, right now they've split this open-wheel IndyCar session into 2. We're opening with some of those F5000 cars on the track, watching that Lola T192. As David, obviously, your good friend Brian Redman, a multiple-time champion in the U.S. What are some of your memories of the F5000 series and running in it and what took place there?
It was a terrific championship. It really was. And it's very unfortunate that the SCCA and a lot of the promoters didn't think of it in the right wavelength. They were so swamped by Can-Am, they were so enamored by Can-Am that they couldn't get their heads around formula. They said, well, in the end, people don't want to watch open wheel races. So they put that silly bodywork on and turned them into Can-Am cars. And then, of course, Champ Car came along, and places like Road America, Laguna Seca never had more people. I mean, they had just fantastic crowds. So they did and I mean, you had the cream of the crop driving them. I mean, you had Little Al, you had Bob, you had Bobby Hunt, you had Little Al, you had Mario Andretti and Brian Redman duped it out for 3 years there. And Brian won the championship 3 times. But I mean, you had a hell of a championship going on. And I don't think they quite realised what they were doing when they got rid of it. But anyway.
Well, David, just to help set the scene, we're getting in the Can-Am cars. Obviously, some of the most visceral, thundering cars that have ever hit a racetrack. Just describe what it was like to be a part of and to drive one of these cars, just to set the scene for us.
Well, I drove a Lola T70, was the first one I drove. and we got the car from Lola, and we went to a place called Snetterton in England, which is a racetrack there, to test it. And it was only a 289 Ford. We should have chosen the shed with a bigger engine. But anyway, when that rumble started behind my head for the first time, I must say, my heart sank a bit. But it was tremendous to drive. It was very responsive. It was a great chassis, that Lola 270. And then, of course, I drove tons of Can-Am cars of one sort or another right through till 1973. But
of the American road racing scene, whether it's stock cars, endurance racing, you name it, it is going to be fantastic here at the M1 Concourse. Nate Dreyer is the third member of our broadcast team today. He has great history on basically everything that's going around this racetrack, and, well, he's going to help you and I navigate this whole program.
Absolutely. He's going to be with us all day long. Hannah Lopa is going to join us as well. As you mentioned, I'll hold...
Now we have our supercar group out there. We have everything from this SRT-10 Viper being chased by a McLaren, which is being chased by a Ford GT. Nate, this is the type of stuff that people dream about seeing in person.
Absolutely, and what this is the culmination. We're going to get to see so many great race cars throughout the day. This group, to start our day, helps show where this technology has taken us to some of the ultimate road cars that you have on the road today.
The noise, which is more powerful, dual overhead cam 4-cylinder, and sounds wonderful, has a little afterburner style header on it.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a car that would have raced in Formula 3 competition, so for drivers on their way up the ladder into likely Formula 1 at that time. And you can just see it's a really fun car to be able to watch. It'll wiggle around through the corners quite a bit. Just a terrific little car to drive, especially on a track like this, 1.5 miles, a high-performance racing circuit that has a good combination of the South Loop, where you have a couple corners that you can string together, the couple of long back straightaways connected by a tight hairpin as well. Really a fun little car for this track.
Well, here's one of the latest, or I should say last, variations of the Can-Am series.
The series ended and effectively relocated to South Africa.
Yeah, for sure. Started as a single-make kind of spec series that was part of, again, talking about maybe getting on your road to IndyCar, to kart at that time. And then eventually, like you said, these cars were sold off, went to South Africa, where the spec series continued for many more years there on an entirely different continent.
And as you mentioned, this is a Dodge.
See, it is just more fun than a barrel full of monkeys out here in a road course.
And what a testament also to the Porsche 911 in general, known for obvious reasons for its exploits on the racing circuit, but the fact that they were able to take these cars and then have as much success as they did on the rally stage as well is just a testament to Porsche, what they built with these cars, and how utilitarian as a race car they are.
Well, if you like sitting a little lower to the ground, how about a 1972 Lola T290 HU28? This was built for 1972 season of competition in the under 2-liter championship.
This was originally one of 4 cars that were brought to the United States by legendary car owner Carl Haas. It has a long weaving history after that as well, but just a beautiful little sports racer machine for sure, with the American Speed Festival logo featured prominently on the front side of the machine as well.
And it was a winner too. Nate, this is the only one that we know of in existence that is still surviving, the sole survivor when it comes to the fabulous Hudson Hornet.
Yeah, this is a car that was originally owned and raced by Herb Thomas in the early 1950s, and Herb, a 2-time NASCAR champion. And in this 92 machine in 1953, Thomas won 15 races on his way to the NASCAR championship. And these Hudson Hornet machines, and it's crazy to think about when you watch this car kind of lumber and move around this track. They were the dominant choice in the early 1950s in NASCAR that you needed to be in.
A little faster and a little more horsepower.
Yeah.
And Mr. Grant, kind of along those lines as well, we talk about Carroll Shelby and doing whatever he wanted. What was it like to be a part of that company under Carroll Shelby's tutelage during that time, and just what was the experience like getting to be at Shelby and getting to be a part of that race program?
Well, I was very blessed. I was one of Carroll Shelby's first employees, and I went to work there in January of '63 in 1042 Princeton Drive, and that's in Venice. And see, it wasn't until 65 they moved over to the airport and they started making the GT350s and et cetera, et cetera.
Whatever that is on a 1901 sweepstakes, right?
Can you imagine going 72 in that?
So what do you think's more dangerous, going 230 down the Mulsanne in the rain at night, or doing 72 on that
Honest
thing?
to God, I would say doing 72 on this. You don't have a lot of protection, do you?
And now, Nate, I'm going to let you explain this. It says Porsche across the front windshield, but you really have to look hard to figure out what Porsche you're looking at.
Well, this one had me fooled yesterday completely.
Yeah, so this car, essentially, you can start by looking at it as a car from the mid-1970s. It was originally a 1974 914. However, the owner also listed this as a 914 993 GT1. That's because while it originally did start as a 914 car from the mid-70s, as I said, you have a 993 sourced flat six engine that this runs off of, and then of course the bodywork is a tribute to the GT1 Le Mans winning cars from the late 90s. So a Franken Porsche, if you would.
Well, I think you could call it just about anything Porsche, because if you start breaking it down, it sounds like there's DNA from just about everything mixed in. Truly remarkable car.
Yeah.
The angle of the wing, the theory being less drag and enough downforce to achieve victory lane. Ralph Shaheen, Brian Loans, Nate Dreyer with you, and Hannah Lopa here as well.
Ralph, like many of my theories in life, theirs didn't work either.
No, they did eventually take those off and went back, Nate, to the traditional big wing mounted to the back.
In fact, it was within the month of May they made that decision. This car has been restored to essentially how it rolled off the truck at Indianapolis in May of 1972, because by the time race day came along, qualifying came along, it was a traditional bolt-on rear wing that was on this machine. As we mentioned throughout the weekend, some other interesting storylines surrounding that, as there were some rule squabbles, as often happens in motorsport. Not often, probably every weekend happens in motorsport.
Yeah.
And essentially, you had the Eagles and some of the other teams showed up just with bolt-on wings. Well, bolt-on wings were not technically allowed by the USAC rulebook for the 1972 season. It had to be an integral part of the body, as you see what takes place on this car. Now, as things got settled out, that obviously did not stay true to what happened. The bolt-on wings were allowed, so the Velis Pernelli-Jones team, with some of the issues that they were having trying to get these dihedral wings dialed in, ultimately just put a big rear wing on the car like what some of the others did, and that is how the car ran throughout the rest of the month of May in 1972.
And here comes the turbine car, the audio for the 1960s qualifying of the Indy 500, but that Novi was fearsome.
Let's listen in on one of those off the engines here in this Samsonite machine.
We move away from the piston-driven car here, and we're piston-powered car. We now move to the Lotus turbine car, and listen to this. It's incredible, Nate. It really is.
Yeah, and Brian, that might be one of our best and most different 1-2 punches and sounds we've heard all day long. We've had so many great ones, but to go from the roar of the offie to the whoosh of the turbine is unbelievable. And this STP Lotus, this is the second year of the Lotus turbine at the Indianapolis 500, 1967. Of course, Pernelli-Jones had the $6 transmission bearing failed, and this year they come back with Joe Leonard driving the lead of the cars throughout the month. Graham Hill, and actually the Graham Hill car is here this weekend as well, not on track, but the Joe Leonard machine, very strong, started on pole, but ultimately DNF'd again with a turbine flameout issue on lap 191 and a 12th place finish. So back-to-back years of heartbreak for the STP team, and Andy Granatelli with their space age type technology with the turbine machines.
It bears a little...
From one cool category, Nate, to another.
Absolutely, and we got a great opportunity yesterday when David Hobbs was with us during this category as well to hear about what a unique series this was, because while you have an F5000, what you can almost technically call a feeder series to Formula One, you had cars that were just about as fast as Formula One, incredibly powerful machines with some of the best drivers as well around the world in this machinery. As we take a look at Seb Coppola and his 1970 Lola T192 F5000 machine. This is a car with a rich history both back in the day and still today, as well as it runs in SVRA, HSR, and more. But a beautiful car here, a red, white, and blue liveried machine, number 12, and one of several Lolas that will be making their way onto the track, as they were the primary builder of these F5000 machinery cars.
It is interesting as we move our way into the 70s with
Bobby Rahal, Teo Fabi, Alan Sir Jr. all drove in this chassis in this car, which was campaigned by Paul Newman Racing. So the later Can-Am series into the 1980s, essentially this is an F5000 car that's been rebodied, but still a car that helped launch a lot of careers. Teo Fabi had an incredible 1981 season. This is a car that won 4 of 10 races in 1981. Fabi finished second in the driver's title, and the team was first in the team championship.
Ralph, I say this with a high level of respect, but you've been around racing a long time.
Thank you, Hannah. Ralph Shaheen, Brian Lones, you've already heard from us. And joining us here in the booth, our buddy Nate Dreyer down there, who knows a little bit about everything, as you're about to find out. And a man who has driven a little bit of everything out there in his career, our good friend David Hobbs joining us. Habbo, you having a fun time here?
Well, thank you very much, Ralph. Yeah, it's good to join you guys. You don't have to stand up just because I'm... Oh, okay. But, yeah, I mean, as you said in the intro, this is a quite extraordinary event. And it's wonderful to see all these cars on the track, so many interesting vehicles. And, of course, if you go to the stands here...
Nate Dreyer and Hannah Lopa is out there somewhere around the racetrack right now. And this is the first ever event here at M1 Concourse like this. And what we've been hearing, if you haven't been with us all weekend, is that the American Speed Festival is coming back, and it's going to be this first weekend in October. We certainly plan on being here each and every year. We sure hope you can join us next year. Brian, it looks like we're going to talk a lot about Shelby Cobra.
Style cars. Nate, these Subarus, despite the fact that they may not have the displacement of, that Lola or the Corvette out there, can likely hang with them.
Oh, for sure. You're looking at cars that have massive aerodynamic upgrades. And, well, yes, the displacement, the engine may not be there. They have done plenty of things to help add to that power that the car is putting out. And it's aero front and rear on some of those cars. And it's so great to be able to see a combination of those cars out in the session, and like this Lola as well. This is this featured group session, which is kind of mixed in. We've got some featured cars, some endurance cars out there right now during this session. This is a really fun one.
Beautiful Lola. We talked
maybe double digits, right?
And when you continue through and you talk about legends of making cars, I think these two cars right on our screen are an example when you think about, obviously, Carroll Shelby, but also Zora Arcus Duntov. And when you think about Duntov as well, and obviously this car and the testing himself that Duntov did was being such a hands-on type engineer, he inspired, when you look at, when you talk about like maybe football and you talk about a coach's coaching tree and those that came from him as a big part of how good of a coach you are. Well, when you think about Duntov and the passion he had, I think one of the key stories when you can draw a straight line in terms of classic American cars, Roy Schoberg, who would go on to be known as Father Viper, he was the head of the Team Viper program. He worked directly under Zora Duntov for all those years for the Corvette program, went on, built the Viper, and what eventually became SRT, the Team Viper team. They very much built those cars in a similar fashion to how Duntov would have tested that car.
Nice.
That's a really good point, Nate. And here's Kip right here. He just all right, Nate, this is right up your wheelhouse. We're going to have Steve Green do a dog walk for us through the Indy cars, and you have at it, buddy. Tell us what we're looking at.
Well, we start out with probably the car that's gotten as much attention as any with that Samsonite special car. And working our way past that here onto the turbine machine, that STP liveried car. And obviously, when you look at the front of this car, and when you look at the entire design, we've talked so much throughout this week about that wedge design machine. If you can kind of just sweep back along the car, we can take a look at that wedge design, that doorstop profile, really, so to speak, with this car. And such a unique design. And we've talked about also...
Two fuel filler caps. See, there's one right there by the STP sticker, and then one right behind the 60 here.
Yeah, so essentially when you're looking at the fuel fill, and obviously a lot of fuel coming in, you'd have a unique rig that'd be going in to help fill that essentially at once, connecting on each side. And the fuel, obviously, the fuel tanks, the fuel cells in an IndyCar, really to this day, still run down the side of the car. So you're getting a bit of a look of that there. And that, of course, number 60, such a famous number design. When you think about kind of the numbers that jumped out, we've talked about that, but to have that number design, that stark black outline, the bullet with the white, kind of a reverse of what most bullets look like. I think that's something about these cars that always really stand out to me iconically as well. Any of the Granatelli STP cars.
Okay, Steve, let's go.
And Steve, while we're at it on this car, if you can sweep back to the front of the car and get us a picture of the front wing, because that's a story we've told throughout the weekend a couple times.
But we can really illustrate it now.
I want to really see it. So, as we mentioned, Jim Ditmore is the main driver listed on this car. Al Unser Sr., also one of the drivers. But this car, this livery, was the Kastner Brophy racing team. So throughout the racing season, Ditmore had some issues, essentially. We talked to the owner of this machine, who's in it right now, Meade Corwin, before the event started. He was telling the story about how essentially you had issues throughout the season of Ditmore hitting other cars and other things throughout the season with that front wing. So throughout the year, slowly, the team owners and the mechanics just kept chopping off that front wing smaller and smaller until you get to what are almost closer to dive planes or canards than a full-on front wing.
Which you would expect, Ralph, that would actually have a negative effect on the performance of the car.
You would think so, right?
It might have been annoying to get your ankle clipped by once in a while, but that seems like it would not be the most swift move in terms of going fast.
I know.
I'm going to be there when that was being shot, and I was asked to leave only because I promised I was never going to leave, and my heels were dragging, and I was yelling, "Do you know who I am?" And they did, and they threw me out anyway. But no, of course I'm joking. It's just a phenomenal example of what can be done as part of this community here at M1 Concourse. As we see, Nate, I'm not saying it's your favorite car here, but I know your little heart goes pitter-patter when you see this car on a racetrack.
Oh, for sure, and it's a car that I'm very familiar with, both personally, I helped with the restoration process, and of course also getting to see this car so often with the vintage Indy work that I do. And first off, great to have cars back out on the track right now and get some action going again. And we have to death talked about this dihedral design just because it's so unique with this car, with the aerodynamics, and obviously a lot of the discussion goes to the dihedrals on the front, but also remember that front nose has built-in dihedral type designs as well. Yep. You don't see a traditional kind of front wing splitter type look. It's instead that built in with that same angle at the front of the car. And that actually at the front of the car is more of a design that would continue on throughout the month of May and throughout the rest of the year, even if the dihedrals went out for a bolt-on wing.
Of course, Joe Leonard drove the Samsonite Special, which is the yellow and white car we're looking at. Nate, there was also the two Viceroy colored cars for Big Al and Mario Andretti. I know you've worked on this car. You have an affinity and affection for it. But if you could get one, are you going the Viceroy colors or are you going in the Samsonite colors?
I think this is the car that had the greatest success, if you care about that.
I'm talking just about the paint scheme.
I will say, in terms of the paint scheme, I would probably prefer the Viceroy. Also an interesting story on the Viceroy, because around that time is when USAC brought on Winston to help sponsor their USAC trail.
What a tremendous disaster you're going to tell us about now.
Those cars, those Viceroy cars, wound up being a massive issue for USAC because the one part of the sponsorship that was included was we don't want any other tobacco manufacturers on the cars. Well, guess what? Bells Pernelli Jones came out with the two Viceroy sponsored cars, and ultimately that massive prize and that massive sponsorship from Winston went away because of those two Viceroy machines.
Even the Samsonite car has a Viceroy logo at the tips of the dihedral wings. Yeah, that's great you brought that up.
It's a great story.
It is a great story. Look at the heat. Away into the fans as well.
Just such a striking car in this white number 4 livery as well that it's in. Obviously most known for, as we mentioned, the Mark Donohue, the Sunoco Penske livery car, but when it's just in white, when you can see these flowing, very simple body lines, it's one of just the most striking race cars. When you combine it with the power you're going to see.
To your point, and as you can see, with the white, you get a good indication of how big and how long that man, a great guy, and full of incredible stories, as you can imagine.
And you talked a little bit about Porsche in terms of the power and the brute force. The other amazing thing about their race program is the traditional bulletproof reliability to go along with that. Despite a company that has put so much power and done so many things like this machine, the fact that they are known and the reason why they have won Le Mans more than anyone else is because of what they are able to do in terms of the reliability on their machines.
Let's listen to the 91730.
That's what happens when you got big old power to put to the ground, huh?
I've been watching. This is David Nicholas that owns this car. It's a 1981 March 817. We've seen it throughout the weekend. It's essentially the later Can-Am series, the second version that were rebodied Formula 5000 cars. But the last few corners, we're watching David in this car, and he's been sideways. He's been fighting this thing a little bit. So getting on the car a little bit, and that, of course, is a big part of the Can-Am series in general throughout the years, is when you have all that power, it definitely puts it in the driver's hands. As he'll work through this sweeping corner, took a little bit wider line into it. He's going to single apex it as he exits that long right-hander here. A little bit of a wiggle on the way out. This is a car that helped launch the careers of Bobby Rahal, Teo Fabi. Alan Jr. drove this car for Paul Newman's team. So a car and a series in the second iteration of the Can-Am series that definitely helped bring along a lot of future stars of, in particular, American open-wheel racing.
Nicholas has a repair shop, which is within rock throwing distance from the facility. And, oh, there he goes again. Guess who drove their race car here?
Who is that?
David Nicholas. Right down Woodward Ave into the facility.
And that is the Woodward Ave.
The Woodward Ave.
Yeah, which stretches a long way.
Yes, and was the epicenter of all things muscle car, clandestine drag racing development back in the 1960s.
Of course, home late summer of the Woodward Dream Cruise that takes place, and a big event, the Woodward Dream Show, part of the events here throughout the calendar year at the M1 Concourse as well. Definitely a handful every time he's under braking, every time he's looking to go down a gear while under braking. You get a little bit of a kick on him as he continues to wheel that Budweiser machine.
He's in a good spot right now because he has the racetrack to himself and he's making full advantage of it. So David Nicholas, by his lonesome out here, he knows he's got all the real estate in the world, so he is really working this car as hard as he can, which is a joy to watch.
And as we mentioned, so this essentially, we saw those Formula 5000 cars earlier. This, in essence, a rebodied version of that for essentially what was the second Can-Am series, and a series that the first Can-Am series obviously was a pinnacle of motorsport type series where you had the biggest drivers we just talked about, Mark Donohue, ad nauseum with the last Porsche 917. This is a series that almost worked more as a feeder type series because of that. As I mentioned, Bobby Rahal, Teo Fabi, and others had their careers launched from this car and from the series in general in the early 1980s as a way to help get up into what would have in particular mostly been the kart series in American open wheel racing and IndyCar racing. As it looks like Nicholas is getting set to bring that car in.
Well, that will be the end of the on-track activity here at the American Speed Festival and its inaugural version. What a way to close things out here at M1 Concourse. The last car on course, an incredible Can-Am machine, and we got to see the 91730. So this is our final on camera. Nate, what'd you think of the weekend?
I mean, I'm obviously supposed to be able to find words to put in to say things. I'm not sure I can quite find the words. That incredible of an event. So great to see the cars, see the people out here, get to go through some of the stories, learn a little bit more myself for certain from you guys and from everyone else. Just an incredible weekend and looking forward to all the future events coming up here.
Before I get to you, let's go to Hannah. Hannah, your thoughts?